I was 24 years old when a trusted neighbor dragged me into a muddy ditch, raped me, and slit my throat to silence me forever. Left for dead, I walked a mile through hell for my son to survive. This is the story of how I defied death before I share the pain I've carried for 47 years. I ask you to join me. Subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell to support survivors like me. Your support shows that our stories matter, that our voices deserve to be heard. Together we can inspire hope and healing for women silenced by violence. My name is Sol. I'm 72 years old, and there's a story I've carried in silence for nearly 5 decades. A story that changed the course of my life forever. Today, with my wrinkled yet firm hands, my tired yet lucid eyes, and a heart that still beats with the strength of someone who has stared death in the face and chosen to live, I want to tell you. Because some stories cannot die with us. They must be told so that other women know that the unthinkable can be survived. I was born in 1952, in the midst of the Franco dictatorship, in a Spain where women were considered eternal, minors, needing our father's permission to work and later, our husbands, for almost everything. I grew up in Valdepeñas, a small La Mancha village where everyone knew everyone, where secrets lasted briefly but prejudices lingered for generations. My childhood was typical for girls of that era, helping at home, learning to sew, to cook, to be a good woman, according to society's standards. But I was always different. I had a quiet rebelliousness that my mother tried to tame with prayers, and my father with threats. I read books in secret, dreamed of traveling, of being independent, of having a life that was solely mine. At 18, I met Javier, a young man from Madrid, who had come to the village to work on the new road construction. He was handsome, spoke of the capital with bright eyes, and promised he'd take me with him when his work was done. Like so many naive young women, I believed love would be my salvation, my ticket to a better life. Javier and I married in 1970, in a small ceremony at the village church. I was 18. He was 23. At first, everything seemed perfect. We moved to Madrid, to a small apartment in the Carabanchel neighborhood. Javier worked in construction, and I found a job in a textile factory. For the first time in my life, I felt free, independent, in control of my destiny. Pedro was born in 1970, when I was just 19. He was a beautiful baby, with his father's dark eyes and my calm temperament. For the first few months, Javier seemed happy to be a father. But soon the problems began. Construction work was unstable. Javier started drinking, and with the alcohol came the blows. At first, they were just shoves when he came home drunk. Then they turned into slaps when dinner wasn't ready on time. Then came punches when Pedro cried at night and kept him from sleeping. The escalation of violence was gradual but relentless, like a disease slowly spreading through the body until it consumes it completely. I tried to talk to my family, but in those days, marriage was sacred, indissoluble. "Endure it, my girl," my mother would say. "All men are like that when they drink. It's your cross, and you have to bear it." My father was more direct. "You got married, now live with the consequences. A decent woman doesn't abandon her husband." The last straw came one winter night in 1973. Javier came home drunker than ever, enraged because he'd lost his job. Pedro, who was 3 then, was playing with wooden blocks on the living room floor. Javier tripped over the toys, and in his fury, raised his hand to hit the child. Something inside me broke at that moment. I lunged between Javier and Pedro, taking the blow meant for my son. "If you ever touch my child again," I said in a voice I didn't recognize as my own, I swear by the Virgin Mary, I will kill you in your sleep." Javier laughed, but something in my eyes made him hesitate. That same night, when Javier fell into his alcoholic stupor, I packed my bags. I took Pedro, the few valuables we had, and we left. I had no money, nowhere to go, but I knew anything was better than staying there. We returned to Valdepeñas, to my parents' house. The reception was cold, full of reproaches and shame. "What will people say?" my mother lamented. "A separated woman with a child in this village. You're ruined, Sol." And in many ways, she was right. In 1973, a divorced woman was a social outcast, especially in a small village. But I had Pedro, and for him, I was capable of enduring any humiliation, any malicious whisper in the market queue, any look of contempt in church. Got a job at the local textile factory, the same one where I had worked before getting married. The wages were miserable, but they were mine. For the first time in years, no one hit me, no one yelled at me, no one made me feel worthless. We lived in a small room in my parents' house. My father barely spoke to me, ashamed to have a failed daughter under his roof. My mother oscillated between compassion and reproach, constantly reminding me that I had chosen this life. But Pedro and I were happy in our own way. At night, after work, I would read him stories. We'd play, and we'd dream together of a better future. To stay strong, both physically and mentally, I started going to the village gym every morning before work. It was a modest place with old machines and rusty weights. But for me, it represented more than just exercise. It was my moment of peace, my ritual of resistance, my way of telling the world I hadn't been defeated. The gym was run by Mr. Ricardo, an older man who had been a boxer in his youth. He was one of the few in the village who didn't judge me for my situation. Physical strength comes from mental strength, he would tell me while correcting my posture on the machines. And you, Sol, have more mental strength than many men I've known. Every morning, at 6 o'clock sharp, I would leave the house to walk the 20 minutes to the gym. It was my sacred time, my small hour of freedom before facing another day of hard work and contemptuous looks. I knew every stone on the path, every tree, every house I passed. It was my routine, my anchor in a world that constantly reminded me I had no place in it. It was February 15th, 1975, a gray Saturday threatening rain. I remember waking up early, as always, and preparing breakfast for Pedro. My son, who was 5 then, was still sleeping soundly, with that tranquility only children who feel safe and loved possess. I kissed his forehead, left a note for my mother, explaining I'd be back by 8 to have breakfast with Pedro, and left the house. I was wearing my navy blue tracksuit, the only one I had, and my white sports shoes I'd bought with my first savings after returning to the village. My brown hair was tied in a high ponytail, and in my small brown leather bag, I carried the essentials: my house key, a few coins for the bus back if it rained heavily, and a photograph of Pedro the man, always carried as a charm. The morning air was fresh and damp, with that characteristic smell of approaching rain. The village streets were practically deserted at that hour, only an occasional early riser heading to work in the fields. The sound of my footsteps on the cobblestones echoed in the morning silence, creating a rhythm that had become as familiar as my own breath. I had seen Mateo Vidal several times at the central village market and in church during Sunday Mass. He was a 32-year-old man, dark-haired, medium height, always impeccably dressed in suits clearly not bought in local shops. He had a smile that many women in the village considered charming, and a way of speaking that inspired confidence. He was courteous to everyone, helped older ladies with their shopping, and greeted children kindly. Everyone in the village knew him as a respectable worker and a model husband. He was married to Sophia, a sweet and shy woman from a wealthy Toledo family. Sophia was pregnant with their first child and looked radiant whenever she walked arm in arm with her husband through the main square. Mateo worked as a supervisor for a construction company in Alcázar de San Juan, the neighboring town, and had a reputation as a responsible family man, one of those who never missed Mass and always had a kind word for everyone. But what no one knew, what I would discover in the most horrible way possible, was that Mateo Vidal was a predator who had perfected the art of the social mask. He had been observing me for weeks, studying my routines, my schedule, waiting for the perfect moment to attack. That February morning, as I headed to the gym on my usual route, I saw him standing next to his car at the corner of Main Street and Carmen Street. It was a white Seat 600 that he always kept spotless, as if it had just rolled off the dealership lot. The car gleamed even under the gray, cloudy sky of that winter morning. He smiled at me with that smile I had seen before at the market, that smile that seemed so genuine, so innocent. "Good morning, Sol," he said, and I was surprised he knew my name. Though in a village like Valdepeñas, everyone knew everyone. His voice was soft, modulated, the voice of an educated and well-spoken man. "Are you going to the gym?" he asked, looking at my sportswear. "I always see you walking around here so early. You're very disciplined." There was something in the way he said, "always," that should have alarmed me. Something that suggested he had been paying more attention to my movements than was normal. But at the time, I interpreted it as a casual observation from a neighbor. "I'm going in the same direction," he continued, opening the passenger door. "I have to stop by the sausage factory to pick up some documents before work. Can I give you a ride? It's starting to rain." And indeed, the first drops had begun to fall, staining the asphalt with small dark circles. In 1975, in a village like Valdepeñas, accepting a ride from a known and respected neighbor didn't seem strange or dangerous. Small towns functioned as communities where people helped each other, where a married man offering a ride to a woman he knew by sight raised no suspicions. Besides, it had started to rain more heavily, and the idea of arriving dry at the gym was appealing. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Vidal," I replied, using the formal address customary in those days. "If it's no trouble, I'd really appreciate it." I got into the car, immediately noticing it smelled of pine air freshener, and the interior was immaculately clean. The seats were navy blue vinyl, and on the dashboard there was a small image of Our Lady of Carmen, the patron saint of drivers. At first, the conversation was completely normal, even pleasant. Mateo had a reassuring way of speaking, asking polite questions about my life without seeming indiscreet. He asked about Pedro, about my job at the textile factory, about how I was adapting to life back in the village after my years in Madrid. "It must be difficult for a young woman to raise a child alone," he commented as he drove along the main road, "especially in a small village where people talk a lot." There was something of genuine compassion in his voice, or so it seemed to me at the time. "But you are a strong woman, it shows. Pedro is lucky to have a mother like you." He told me that Sophia was very excited about the pregnancy, that they were expecting a girl and had already chosen the name, Carmen, like the Virgin. He spoke of his wife with what seemed like genuine affection, describing her cravings, her first time, fears, her plans to decorate the baby's room. He told me about his work at the construction company, his plans to expand the business, the new house they were building on the outskirts of the village. "My Sophia is very delicate," he told me with a smile that at the time I interpreted as marital tenderness. "She can't exert herself. The doctor says she needs bed rest. That's why I leave so early, to let her sleep and not bother her with the car noise." This information, which should have been just a domestic anecdote, was actually part of his strategy. Matteo had meticulously planned this encounter, knowing exactly how to justify his presence on that street at that hour. But something began to change about 10 minutes into the drive. Instead of continuing on the main road towards the town center, where the gym was, Matteo took a left turn onto a dirt road I didn't know well. It was a rural route that meandered between vineyards and olive groves, moving further and further away from the village. "Excuse me, Mr. Vidal," I said, trying to keep a casual tone despite the alarm bells that had started ringing in my head. "Wouldn't it be faster to take the main road? I think we're going in the opposite direction from the gym." "I know a shortcut," he replied without taking his eyes off the road, his voice still calm but with a different, firmer, more determined nuance. "We'll get there faster this way, and we'll avoid the truck traffic going to the flour mill." It was a plausible explanation, but something in his tone made me uncomfortable. The road became narrower and more desolate with each passing kilometer. On both sides stretched empty fields, some ancient olive groves with their twisted trunks, and vineyards that at that time of year looked bare and gray. The raindrops hit the windshield with more intensity, and Matteo turned on the wipers, whose regular squeak became the only sound filling the growing silence between us. It was then that I began to feel that sensation every woman knows, that primal, ancestral instinct that warns us of danger when we're in the presence of a predator. It was as if 1,000 little bells had started ringing in my head, as if my whole body was screaming at me that something was wrong. The air inside the car had become thick, charged with a tension I couldn't identify, but which made me want to run away. I observed Matteo's profile as he drove, and noticed his expression had subtly changed. The kind smile had vanished, replaced by an intense concentration on the road that seemed forced. His hands gripped the steering wheel with more force than necessary, and there was a rigidity in his shoulders that hadn't been there at the beginning of the trip. "You know what, Mr. Vidal?" I said, making an effort to keep my voice firm and polite. "I think I'd prefer to get out here. I can walk the rest of the way. I don't want you to be late for work because of me." It was a transparent lie, but I hoped it would be enough to get me out of this situation that was increasingly giving me a bad feeling. But Matteo didn't stop the car. Instead, he accelerated slightly, and that's when my blood ran cold. "Don't worry, Sol," he said, and for the first time I noticed he had stopped using the respectful usted and was now using tu. His voice had completely changed, becoming deeper, colder, with a nuance I had never heard before, but instinctively recognized as dangerous. "We'll get to where we need to go soon," he continued, and those words hit me like a punch to the stomach. He hadn't said where you need to go or where you're going, but where we need to go. As if our destination was shared, as if we were accomplices in something I didn't understand. "Stop the car, please," I said, this time more firmly, dropping all pretense of courtesy. Fear had begun to consume me, a cold liquid fear that spread through my insides like poison. I want to get out right now. But Matteo kept driving as if I hadn't spoken. When I tried to reach for the door handle, he extended his right arm and gripped my wrist with a breathtaking force. It was a brutal, desperate strength, the strength of someone who had meticulously planned this and wasn't going to let his plans be thwarted. "Calm down, Sol," he said with that voice I now recognize as the voice of absolute evil. a voice that had lost all pretense of humanity. "We are just going to get to know each other a little better. I've been watching you for weeks, studying your schedule, waiting for the perfect moment." His words came out slowly, savored, as if he enjoyed the terror he saw in my eyes. "You're very pretty when you walk alone in the mornings," he continued, his grip on my wrist tightening even more. "I like you very much, Sol. I've liked you for a long time, and today we're finally going to be together." The words flowed from his mouth like venom, each syllable laden with a malice that chilled me to the bone. I tried to break free, but it was useless. Mateo was much stronger than I was, and his grip was like an iron trap. With his free hand, he continued to drive, taking us further and further away from any place where there might be help. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears, and my hands began to tremble uncontrollably. "Please," I begged, my voice breaking. "I have a small child. Pedro is waiting for me. Please let me go. I won't tell anyone, I swear." Tears had begun to stream down my cheeks, and I knew, with that terrible, bone-chilling certainty, that my life was in mortal danger. Mateo laughed, a dry, cruel laugh that was devoid of humanity. "Your son? Don't worry about him. Where you're going, you won't need to worry about anything ever again." His words were like stabs to my heart, because I understood perfectly what he was implying. The car stopped in a completely isolated place, surrounded by ancient olive groves and thick brush. There were no houses in sight, no secondary roads, nothing to indicate the presence of other human beings for miles around. It was the perfect place for a crime, a place where screams would reach no ears, where a body could remain hidden for months. Mateo turned off the engine and turned to me with a smile I will never forget. A smile that was utterly inhuman. It was the smile of a predator who had cornered his prey. The expression of someone who knew he had absolute power over another person and planned to fully enjoy it. "Now we're going to have some fun," he said, his voice laden with an anticipation that nauseated me. "I've been waiting for you for a long time, Sol, dreaming of you. And now you're finally here, with me, where no one can bother us." What happened next are images that have remained etched in my memory for 47 years like branding irons. Images that appear in my darkest nightmares, waking me in the middle of the night, drenched in cold sweat, my heart pounding as if it would burst from my chest. Mateo forcibly dragged me out of the car, pulling me by the arm with a violence that left me bruised for weeks. When I tried to scream, to call for help to a god who seemed to have abandoned that place, he covered my mouth with a large, calloused hand while holding me by the waist with the other, completely immobilizing me. "Don't scream," he said, his hot breath against my ear. "Because no one will hear you here. We are completely alone, you and I. And if you scream, if you give me trouble, it will be much worse for you than it's already going to be." The implicit threat in his words was clear, and I understood that I was completely at his mercy. He dragged me towards an area of thick bushes, away from the dirt road, to a place where even a passing cart wouldn't be able to see us. The rain had intensified, and the ground was muddy and slippery. I vividly remember the smell of damp earth mixed with the scent of wild herbs, the sound of branches breaking under our feet, the noise of my own agitated and desperate breathing. The ground was covered with dead leaves and small stones that dug into my knees when Mateo forced me to kneel. The dampness of the earth seeped through my tracksuit, and I could feel the cold rising up my legs like icy fingers. "Now you're going to be very good to me," he said, beginning to unbuckle his belt with one hand while keeping the other over my mouth. You're going to do exactly what I tell you, when I tell you. And if you're obedient, maybe you won't have to suffer too much. What followed was a brutal rape that felt like hours but was probably minutes. This simple clinical word, rape, cannot contain the atrocious reality of what I experienced. It cannot express the absolute terror of feeling my body desecrated, my humanity torn from me piece by piece. It cannot describe the sensation of being destroyed from within, not only physically but spiritually. The certainty that the soul who had left her house that morning had vanished forever. During those eternal minutes, my mind disconnected from my body as a survival mechanism. It was as if I were floating above the scene, watching what was happening to another woman, because what was happening to me was too horrible to be real. Matteo raped me with a viciousness that went beyond sexual gratification. It was an act of absolute domination, of complete destruction. As he did it, he said obscene things to me, describing in detail how he had fantasized about this moment, how he had planned every second of what he was doing to me. "Do you like it, bitch?" he growled in my ear. "This is what you wanted, isn't it? That's why you walk alone every morning, provoking decent men. But I know what you really are. I know what you need." His words were like acid poured into open wounds, designed to destroy not only my body, but my soul. When he finished raping me, I thought I had reached the end of my nightmare, but I was terribly wrong. Matteo wasn't done with me. From the inside pocket of his jacket, he pulled out a long, sharp knife, a killing knife that gleamed with a sinister glow under the gray light of the cloudy sky. "You know too much about me, now," he said with a calm that was more terrifying than any scream or threat. "You've seen my face, you know my car, you know my name. I can't leave you alive, Sul. I'm sorry, but I have no choice." The casual way he spoke of killing me, as if it were a simple domestic task to be completed, filled me with a terror I had never experienced. The first stab wound I received was on the left side of my neck, just below my ear. I felt the cold metal penetrate my skin as if it were butter, and then the immediate viscous warmth of my own blood beginning to gush out. The pain was indescribable, as if a branding iron had been thrust into me. But worse than the physical pain was the certainty that I was dying. "This is just a start," Matteo said, observing with morbid fascination as the blood welled from the wound. "I want you to know it's happening. I want you to feel every second." It was clear he was enjoying not only the act of killing me, but the process, the fear in my eyes, my suffering. The second stab was much worse. Matteo plunged the knife 8 centimeters into the right side of my neck, cutting muscles, tendons, barely grazing arteries. Blood began to spurt out, soaking my clothes, the ground, everything around me. I could feel life escaping with every beat of my heart, my strength fading second by second. The pain was beyond description. It was as if I had been set on fire, from within, as if thousands of hot needles were piercing me simultaneously. But worse than the physical pain was the psychological certainty that I was dying, that I would never see Pedro again, that my son would grow up without his mother. Matteo watched me for a few seconds, seeing me struggle between life and death, enjoying his work. Then he grabbed me by the ankles and dragged me a few meters to a small ravine where a shallow stream flowed, swollen by that morning's rain. He threw me there like an object, like trash to be discarded. The water was icy and murky, mixed with mud and dead leaves. When my body hit the water, the shock of the cold momentarily brought me back to my senses, but it also made me aware of the gravity of my situation. Matteo began to kick my head with systematic fury, trying to drown me in the shallow water, to ensure I would drown, if blood loss didn't kill me first. Each kick was like a hammer blow that made me see stars, and I felt my skull would explode under the pressure. "Die already, bitch," he screamed as he kicked me. "Die!" His screams mixed with the sound of the rain and the murmur of the water, creating a diabolical symphony that will forever be the soundtrack to my worst nightmares. But in the midst of that absolute horror, in the midst of that certainty of death, something within me refused to surrender. In the darkest moment, when darkness seemed to swallow everything, I thought of Pedro. I visualized his 5-year-old face sleeping peacefully in his bed, trusting that his mommy would come home to have breakfast with him. I thought about how he would feel if his mommy never returned, how it would affect him to grow up without me, how my mother would explain to him that I had vanished forever. And at that moment, with the icy water of the stream mixing with my blood, with the rain hitting my face and Mateo's kicks growing weaker, I made the most important decision of my life. I was not going to die. I was not going to let this monster take away my chance to see my son grow up, to hug him again, to tell him how much I loved him. It was then that I resorted to a survival strategy I didn't know I possessed. When Mateo paused for a moment to catch his breath, I pretended to be dead. I let my body go completely limp, remained absolutely motionless, holding my breath as long as I could. I let my eyes stay open but glazed, staring into nothing, and allowed my body to sink naturally into the muddy water of the stream. Mateo leaned over me, bringing his ear close to my mouth to listen for my breath. I could feel his breath on my face. I could smell the sweat on his skin. I could perceive the satisfaction in his breathing. Finally, he murmured, "It's about time." He stood up and began to wipe the knife on his pants, as if it were any tool he had just used for a domestic task. I heard his footsteps receding through the mud, his heavy, determined steps. I heard the sound of something heavy falling into the deeper water of the stream. Probably my bag with my documents and money. Then I heard another splash, surely the knife he had used to attack me. Mateo was destroying the evidence, eliminating any trace that could connect him to me. I heard the car door open and close, the engine starting with that characteristic roar of the Seat 600. I heard the sound of the vehicle driving away down the dirt road, the wheels splashing mud, the engine gradually fading into the distance, until it became a whisper. And then, nothing. Only when I was completely sure he was gone, only when the sound of the engine had completely disappeared, and only the murmur of the water and the drumming of the rain remained, did I dare to move. And that's when I realized the true magnitude of what had happened. I was completely naked. My clothes had been torn to shreds during the rape, and Mateo had thrown the pieces everywhere. My body was covered in blood, mud, and icy water. The 2 wounds on my neck were still bleeding, though less profusely than at first. When I tried to stand up, my legs didn't respond properly. It was as if they belonged to someone else. When I tried to speak, to scream for help, no sound came from my throat. The wounds had affected my ability to vocalize, and all that emerged was a hoarse croak that terrified me as much as everything else that had happened. I managed to find the remnants of my underwear, which were torn but still something. With trembling hands that barely obeyed me, I managed to cover the wounds on my neck with the fabric. I knew instinctively that I couldn't make a tourniquet, because that would completely cut off blood flow and kill me. But I needed to stop the bleeding somehow. Every movement was an indescribable agony. Every breath required superhuman effort. My blood pressure had dropped so low due to blood loss that I could hear my own heart beating in my ears like a tribal drum, irregular and desperate. The remains of my blue tracksuit were scattered on the ground, soaked with blood and mud. I managed to retrieve the top, which, although torn and dirty, could provide me with some warmth and dignity. I managed to put it on, although the effort left me breathless and dizzy. I started walking. I don't know where I found the strength. I don't know how my legs found the will to move. But I started walking. I had to get somewhere where there were people, where they could help me. I couldn't die in that godforsaken place. I couldn't let Pedro grow up without knowing what had happened to his mother. The world around me looked blurry and distorted, as if I were seeing through a fogged glass or as if I were underwater. The colors had faded. Everything looked in shades of gray and sepia. Every few meters I had to stop, sit on any stone or log I found, and try to catch my breath. My heart pounded so hard and so irregularly that I thought it was going to burst from my chest. There were moments when the beats accelerated into a desperate gallop, and others when they seemed to stop completely, leaving me with the feeling that I was about to faint. I walked for what seemed like hours, but was probably between 30 and 40 minutes. The rain continued to fall, not with the initial intensity, but with a persistence that soaked my torn clothes and made the cold seep into my bones like icy fingers. Every drop that touched the wounds on my neck was like a small electric stab. At times, the world would go completely black, and I would lose consciousness, collapsing into the mud on the road. But always, the image of Pedro made me wake up. I saw him in my dreams, asking where I was, why I hadn't come home. His little child's voice called to me from somewhere far away, and that call was stronger than death. During the walk, my mind began to play cruel tricks on me. Blood loss and trauma were affecting my perception of reality. I saw strange things, sinister figures that couldn't possibly be there. In the trees lining the road, I thought I saw hanging dolls, grotesque figures with distorted faces watching me with empty eyes. There were teddy bears hanging from the branches, it seemed to me, with their heads tilted at impossible angles, as if they had been hanged. Their black button eyes followed me as I walked, and I felt they were mocking my desperation. I knew they couldn't be real, but they were so vivid, so detailed, that they terrified me almost as much as what had happened with Mateo. My mind, trying to process a trauma beyond its capacity to comprehend, created these hallucinations as a way to divert attention from the real pain. But the effect was that I felt as if I were walking through a nightmare, as if I had crossed the threshold into a world where the normal rules of reality no longer applied. Despite these terrifying visions, I kept walking, because I knew that if I stopped, if I surrendered to the madness that tried to take over my mind, I would never see my son again. Pedro was my anchor in reality, my reason for resisting both physical pain and mental dislocation. Gradually, my vision began to deteriorate even further. What had started as blurred vision turned into a kind of tunnel vision, where I could only see directly ahead, as if looking through a telescope. The edges of my visual field had turned completely black. Finally, when I had lost all hope, when my vision had been reduced to just a sliver of light in the midst of darkness, I saw something that made me cry with relief. It was a warm yellow light, the light of an illuminated window. It was a house, a modest country house with a small front garden and a green-painted wooden gate. I could see that there were several dogs in the yard, large, fierce-looking dogs that would normally have posed a significant threat to someone in my condition. But at that moment, even the possibility of being attacked by dogs seemed preferable to dying alone on that desolate road. As I approached the gate, when I tried to call out with my voice that no longer existed, something I can only describe as miraculous happened. The dogs, which I later learned always aggressively attacked any stranger approaching the property. Approached me with curiosity but no signs of hostility. There were 7 dogs of different sizes and breeds, from a huge German shepherd to several fierce-looking mixed breeds. Any of them could have torn me apart in my weakened state. But instead of attacking me, they surrounded me in a way I can only describe as protective. It was as if they could feel my pain, my despair, my complete helplessness. The larger dogs positioned themselves at my sides, like bodyguards, while the smaller ones approached my legs without aggression, sniffing my bloody clothes with what seemed to be genuine concern. When I managed to open the gate with the little strength I had left, the dogs accompanied me to the house door, walking at my pace, staying close but not hindering my clumsy and desperate movements. It was as if they were guardian angels who had taken animal form to escort me to salvation. The front door of the house was ajar, probably because the owners had gone out into the garden to investigate why the dogs weren't barking, as was their custom. With the little strength I had left, I pushed the door open and crawled inside because I could no longer stand. The first room was a small, cozy living room with simple but well-maintained furniture, family photos on the walls, and the smell of freshly brewed coffee that painfully reminded me of normal mornings at home with Pedro. I collapsed onto the cold tiled floor, feeling the blood spreading beneath me. Clara Lopez, a young woman in her 30s who was in the kitchen preparing breakfast for her family, saw me and let out a scream of horror that echoed through the house. It was a cry that mixed shock, terror, and compassion. The cry of someone who had never seen anything so horrible, but instinctively knew she had to help. Miguel, come quick," she cried as she knelt beside me. "There's a woman here, she's hurt. She's covered in blood." Her voice trembled, but there was a determination in it that immediately let me know I was in good hands. Miguel Lopez appeared immediately, coming out of what seemed to be a bedroom. He was a tall, strong man, around 40, with calloused working hands but kind eyes. When he saw me there on his living room floor, soaked in blood and barely conscious, he didn't hesitate for a second. "My God, what happened to her?" he exclaimed. But it was clear he wasn't expecting an immediate answer. Miguel was clearly a practical man, accustomed to making quick decisions in crisis situations. "Clara, call an ambulance right now," he ordered his wife as he knelt beside me. "And bring towels, lots of clean towels," he continued, examining my wounds with a combination of horror and professional determination. "Also bring blankets. She's in shock. She needs warmth." Miguel spoke to me in a soft but firm voice, a voice that radiated competence and compassion. "Don't worry, ma'am. You're safe now. We're here to take care of you. We're going to call an ambulance, and everything will be fine." Clara covered me with a white wool blanket while frantically dialing the emergency number on a black rotary phone hanging on the kitchen wall. I could hear her broken voice explaining the situation to the operator. "We have a young woman here. She's seriously injured. She has deep cuts on her neck. She's lost a lot of blood." I tried desperately to speak, to explain what had happened, to ask them to notify my family. But only guttural, incomprehensible sounds came from my shattered throat. The frustration of not being able to communicate added to the physical horror of my situation. Clara, who was an intuitive and compassionate woman, immediately understood that I wanted to communicate and briefly disappeared, returning with paper and a pencil. "Can you write?" she asked softly. "Can you tell us your name?" With hands that trembled so much I could barely control them, I managed to write in shaky letters. "Sol, Pedro, my son. Tell parents, Valdepeñas." Each word required enormous effort, and the handwriting was barely legible, but it was enough for them to understand the basics. Her son's name is Pedro, Clara told Miguel. She lives in Valdepeñas. We need to notify her parents. Then she turned to me with a maternal tenderness that made me cry. Don't worry about your son, Sol. We'll make sure he knows you're okay, that you're being taken care of. The ambulance arrived in 7 minutes, though it felt like 7 hours to me. I heard the sirens approaching along the rural road, a sound that had never been so beautiful, so full of hope. It was the sound of salvation, of the possibility of seeing Pedro again, of having a second chance at life. The paramedics were 2 young men, professional and efficient, who had clearly seen serious cases before, but were visibly shocked by my condition. My God, one of them murmured as he examined the wounds on my neck. How did she get here with these injuries? It's a miracle she's alive, the other commented as they prepared the stretcher. She's lost an incredible amount of blood. We have to move her very carefully. He reassured me with a professional but humane voice. Ma'am, I'm Luis. I'm a paramedic. We're going to take you to the hospital. You're going to be okay, but you need to stay awake, all right? It's very important that you don't fall asleep. When they tried to lay me completely flat on the stretcher, I panicked because I couldn't breathe in that position. The neck wounds had affected my breathing capacity, and lying flat partially blocked my airways with clotted blood. I made desperate gestures to make them understand I couldn't breathe like that. Luis immediately understood the problem. Ah, of course, the neck wounds. Let's raise the head of the stretcher, he told his partner. As they adjusted the stretcher, he explained, It's normal that you can't breathe, lying completely flat. We'll keep you in a position that allows you to breathe better. On the way to Getafe Hospital, which was the nearest medical center capable of treating severe emergencies, the police intercepted the ambulance. It was standard procedure in cases of evident violence, and the paramedics had already reported that it was clearly an attempted murder. A young officer boarded the vehicle and tried to ask me questions about what had happened. I couldn't speak, but I managed to make gestures and signs that he interpreted correctly. With great patience, he asked me yes or no questions that I could answer by nodding or shaking my head, although each movement was painful. Was it a man? Yes. Did you know him? Yes. Was he from the village? Yes. Did he have a car? Yes. Was the car white? Yes. Was the man dark-haired? Yes. Was he short? Yes. With this basic information, the police already had a profile to start the investigation. I also managed to communicate my home address so they could immediately contact my parents. Don't worry, ma'am, the police officer told me with a determination that reassured me. We're going to catch whoever did this to you. I promise. And we're going to notify your family immediately. We arrived at Getafe Hospital, where I was taken directly to the emergency room. The place was a hive of activity, with doctors and nurses moving quickly, shouting instructions to each other, preparing medical equipment with an efficiency that reassured me. Dr. Marcos Garcia, the on-call physician, was an older man in his 50s, with gray hair, expert hands, and a reassuring voice that had comforted thousands of patients throughout his career. When he saw me, he didn't try to minimize the seriousness of my situation, but he didn't fill me with terror either. Ms. Sol, he said as he examined my wounds with a small flashlight. You are very serious. I won't lie to you. But I've seen worse cases, and we're going to do everything in our power to save you. The most important thing now is for you to stay calm and stay awake, okay? Stay awake for your son, Pedro. The fact that he used Pedro's name greatly reassured me. It meant they had contacted my family. that they knew who I was, that I wasn't just an anonymous case to them. I was a person with a name, a family, with a son who needed me. Throughout the initial treatment, I remained conscious, which was both a blessing and a curse. I could see everything they were doing to me. I could hear all the orders Dr. Garcia gave to the nurses. I could feel every stitch they put in to close the wounds. It was surreal to be so close to death, and at the same time be so lucid, so present in every moment of the process. "We need to suture these wounds immediately," the doctor told a nurse as he carefully cleaned the cuts. "But first we need to clean them well to prevent infections. She's been in dirty water. There's probably bacteria and sediment in the wounds." The cleaning process was agonizing. Every time they touched the wounds with the disinfectant-soaked gauze, it was as if hot needles were being driven into me. But I knew it was necessary, that it was the price I had to pay to stay alive. "You are very brave," one of the nurses told me, an older woman named Isabel, who had probably seen every imaginable horror in her career, but still retained her capacity for compassion. Not all patients can stay so calm during a procedure like this. Dr. Garcia worked with complete concentration, carefully suturing each layer of damaged tissue. "By a millimeter," he murmured as he worked. By a millimeter, it didn't cut her carotid artery. If it had been a millimeter deeper, she would have bled to death in less than 5 minutes. After stabilizing the main wounds, I was transferred to the intensive care unit. It was a quiet, efficient room, full of machines that beeped and monitored every aspect of my physical condition. The constant sound of heart monitors became the soundtrack of the following days. But the strangest part was yet to come. After 3 days in intensive care, during which the doctors managed to completely stabilize my condition and the wounds began to heal properly, I completely lost my sight. From one day to the next, without prior warning, the world turned completely black. There was no medical explanation for this sudden blindness. The most experienced ophthalmologists in the hospital examined me thoroughly and declared my eyes were perfectly healthy. There was no damage to the corneas, retinas, or optic nerves. Physically, there was no reason why I couldn't see. "It's something we've seen before in cases of extreme trauma," Dr. Garcia explained to me with the honesty that characterized all his communications with me. Sometimes the mind protects itself by shutting down certain senses. It's a psychological defense reaction. In some patients, sight gradually returns. In others, well, we'll have to wait and see. During those days of total blindness, I received the first visits from my family. Hearing my parents' footsteps approaching my bed, feeling my mother's hands taking mine, was an experience that filled me with such profound gratitude that I couldn't express it in words. "My child!" my mother cried, her voice broken by emotion. "My dear girl, thank God you're alive. When the police called us, we thought we had lost you forever." Her weeping was heartbreaking, but also liberating. It was the cry of someone who had feared the worst and had discovered that there was still hope. My father, a man of few words and even fewer displays of affection, took my hand with a tenderness he hadn't shown since I was very small. "We're here, daughter," was all he said. But in those 3 words, there was all the love and support I needed. But the most important visit, the one that gave me strength to keep fighting, was Pedro's. When my 5-year-old boy entered the hospital room, guided by my mother, and touched my hand with his small, soft fingers, I knew that all the pain, all the suffering, had been worth it. "Mommy, why can't you see?" Pedro asked me with that brutal innocence only children have. His little voice was exactly as I had remembered it during those terrible moments in the stream. the voice that had given me strength to keep walking. "I don't know, my love," I replied, because it was the truth. "But I can hear you. I can touch you. And that's the most important thing in the world to me." I hugged him carefully, due to my injuries, but with all the intensity of a mother who had been on the verge of losing the chance to hug her child forever. Pedro stayed with me for hours, telling me about his week at his grandparents' house, about the drawings he had made for me, about how he had prayed every night for me to get well. His presence was more effective than any medicine, more comforting than any words from the doctors. During my stay in the hospital, my father told me that Mateo Vidal had been arrested. The investigation had been quick and efficient, facilitated by the security cameras recently installed by the town council on the main streets of the village as part of a modernization program. "The cameras caught him when he picked you up that morning," my father explained with a vengeful satisfaction I had never heard in his voice before. "And when they searched his car, they found evidence he couldn't explain. The investigation had revealed that Mateo had meticulously washed his Seat 600 after the attack, but forensic science in the 70s was already advanced enough to detect remnants of evidence. They found fibers from my clothes on the seats, traces of earth from the attack site on the tires, and, most incriminating of all, biological evidence that irrefutably confirmed I had been in his car. At first, he denied everything," my father continued. "He invented a ridiculous story about lending the car to a cousin, about not remembering where he had been that morning. But the evidence was too clear. When he was cornered, he changed his strategy completely. News of the arrest had spread through Valdepeñas like wildfire. The townspeople were shocked. Mateo Vidal had been considered an exemplary citizen, a model husband, a responsible future father. The idea that he was capable of such brutality was incomprehensible to many. His poor wife," my mother said, shaking her head sadly. "Sophia knew nothing. When she found out, she fainted. She's 7 months pregnant, the poor creature. I don't know how she's going to get through this." Sophia's tragedy was almost as horrible as mine. To discover that the man she had married, the father of her unborn child, was a rapist and potential murderer, must have been devastating. Mateo had been transferred to the provincial prison of Toledo while awaiting trial. The case had attracted local media attention, not only because of the brutality of the crime, but also because of the contrast between the accused's public image and the nature of his actions. My physical recovery was faster than the doctors had expected. The neck wounds healed surprisingly well, leaving visible scars but without causing permanent damage to my ability to speak or swallow. The loss of movement in the tip of my tongue was the only lasting effect, and even that was minimal. But my visual recovery was a medical mystery that confounded all specialists. After 5 days of total blindness, my sight began to return gradually, as if a curtain was slowly rising. First, I could distinguish vague shapes, then outlines, finally details and colors. "We have no explanation for this," the chief ophthalmologist admitted after examining me for the 5th time. "Medically, there was no reason for you to lose your sight. And medically, there's no reason for you to have regained it. It's as if your mind decided to protect you from the visual trauma by temporarily shutting down that sense, and then decided it was safe to see again. Dr. Garcia had a different theory, more spiritual than scientific. Sometimes," he told me, as he prepared me for discharge, "the human body does things that science cannot explain, especially in cases of extreme survival like yours. You went through something that should have killed you, and not only did you survive, but you walked 1.5 miles to seek help. That's not just explained by physiology." When I was finally discharged after 2 weeks in the hospital, I felt like a completely different person. Physically, I was weaker, more fragile. The scars on my neck were a constant reminder of what had happened. But emotionally, I felt stronger than I had ever been. I had looked death in the eye and decided to live. I had found reserves of strength I didn't know I possessed. I had discovered that I was capable of surviving the unthinkable and coming out the other side not only alive, but determined to live fully. Mateo Vidal's trial took place 6 months after the attack. By then, I had fully recovered my physical strength and my ability to speak, though my voice had changed slightly, becoming hoarser, a permanent reminder of the wounds I had suffered. The case attracted considerable attention, not only in Valdepeñas, but throughout the entire province. It was rare for a case of rape and attempted murder to go so far in the judicial system of the 70s, especially when the accused had such a solid reputation in the community. But the evidence was overwhelming, and my survival had made the case impossible to ignore. When it was time to testify, I had completely regained my sight and my ability to speak. I had spent months psychologically preparing for that moment, working with a village priest who served as an informal counselor, as psychological therapy as we know it today didn't really exist then. On the day of the trial, the courtroom was packed. There were journalists from Madrid, curious townspeople, relatives of both sides. Sofia, Mateo's wife, was present with their newborn baby girl, a child who had been born while her father was in pretrial detention. The image of that young woman, devastated by the revelations about her husband, carrying an innocent creature, was heartbreaking. Mateo avoided my gaze throughout the entire process. He was there, dressed in a clean suit. His family had probably brought him, his hair neatly combed, trying to project the image of the respectable man the town had known. But I could see beyond that mask. I could see the monster who had revealed himself that February morning. His defense strategy was as predictable as it was insulting. Instead of denying the facts completely, which would have been impossible given the evidence, Mateo claimed that everything had been consensual. According to his version, I had voluntarily agreed to have sexual relations with him, and the injuries had been the result of an accident during a subsequent argument. "Ms. Sol," he declared in a voice that maintained its educated and modulated tone, agreed to get into my car voluntarily. We engaged in intimate relations by mutual agreement. Afterwards, when she felt guilty about what we had done, she started screaming that she was going to tell everyone. In the ensuing argument, she tripped and fell onto a knife I was carrying to protect myself from thieves who frequent rural roads. It was a story so ridiculous, so insulting to intelligence, that even his own lawyer seemed ashamed to have to present it. How did he explain that I had walked 1.5 miles with wounds that should have killed me? How did he explain the brutality of the cuts, the evidence of struggle, the condition in which I was found? But most offensive of all was the implication that I, a single mother struggling to survive in a society that already judged me harshly, would have risked everything for a casual sexual encounter with a married man. It was a strategy that relied on the prejudices of the time about fallen women and the belief that rape victims somehow asked for it. When it was my turn to testify, I rose with all the dignity I could muster. The scars on my neck were clearly visible, a physical reminder of the brutality I had suffered. My voice, though it had regained most of its strength, still bore the marks of the wounds. I told my story with every detail I could remember, from the moment I got into the car until I lost consciousness at the Lopez family's house. I described the evident planning in Mateo's actions, his knowledge of my routines, the calculated way he had taken me to that isolated place. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," I said, looking directly at the 12 men who would decide Mateo's fate. "I did not ask for what happened to me. I did not provoke anything. I was just a woman trying to stay strong to raise her son, and this man decided he had the right to destroy my life to satisfy his vilest impulses." The prosecutor presented the medical evidence, the photographs of my injuries, the forensic reports from Mateo's car. Every piece of evidence completely contradicted the accused's version. The doctors testified about the impossibility of the injuries being accidental, about the precision and depth of the cuts. Dr. Garcia, who had saved my life that night, testified about the condition in which I had arrived at the hospital. "In my 20 years of medical career," he declared, "I had never seen anyone arrive alive with such severe injuries. The fact that Ms. Soul was able to walk over a kilometer in those conditions defies all medical explanation. It is a testament to an extraordinary will to live." Miguel and Clara Lopez also testified, describing how they had found me, my condition, how even their dogs, normally aggressive with strangers, had protected me. It was as if they knew she was a soul in danger. Clara testified with tears in her eyes. I had never seen anything like it. The jury deliberated for 2 days. They were 2 days of unbearable anxiety, during which my family and I waited at home, praying, trying not to think about the possibility of Mateo being acquitted. The idea that he could walk free, that he could return to the streets of Valdepeñas as if nothing had happened, was terrifying. Finally, the jury returned with the verdict. "Guilty," they declared, "of first-degree rape and attempted murder." Mateo was sentenced to 25 years in prison, a severe sentence for the time, but one that seemed insufficient to me, considering what he had tried to do to me. But the judicial system of the 70s was very different from today's. Rehabilitation and parole laws meant that Mateo would not serve his full sentence. In fact, he was released after only 12 years for good behavior and successful rehabilitation. When I found out about his release in 1987, 12 years after the attack, I felt as if my soul had been ripped from my body. 12 years for raping me, for trying to kill me, for changing my life forever. It was a mockery of justice, a slap in the face to all victims of sexual violence. The years following the trial were in many ways the most difficult of my life. Although I had obtained legal justice, emotional justice was much more elusive. I had constant nightmares, so vivid that I would wake up screaming, drenched in cold sweat, my heart pounding as if it would burst from my chest. I couldn't be alone, at home after dark. Every unexplained noise, every shadow at the window, every creak of the old house's wood made me jump. I developed a terrible phobia of rain because the sound of falling water immediately transported me back to that horrible morning, to the sensation of the icy stream water mixing with my blood. Pedro, my precious son, was my salvation during those dark years. He grew up without fully understanding what had happened, but instinctively becoming more protective of me. He became a serious child prematurely, always asking if I was okay, always making sure the doors were locked before he went to sleep. "Mommy, are you sad about the marks on your neck?" he once asked me when he was 8 years old, gently touching the scars with his little fingers. "I don't like them because they hurt you, but they're part of you, and I love you completely." Those words from my 8-year-old son taught me more about acceptance and unconditional love than all the adult advice I had received. Pedro didn't see the scars as something that defined or diminished me. For him, they were simply part of his mommy, just like her brown eyes or brown hair. I returned to work at the textile factory 6 months after the attack. But everything had changed. My co-workers treated me with a mixture of compassion and morbid curiosity that I found exhausting. Some were wonderful, supporting me, protecting me from malicious glances and comments. But others whispered behind my back, speculating about what really had happened. "She must have done something to provoke him," I heard one of them say during a break. "Decent women don't get into those kinds of problems." Those comments hurt me more than the physical wounds, because they attacked my dignity, my right to be a blameless victim. That victim blaming was endemic in 70s society. Women victims of sexual violence faced not only the trauma of the attack, but also social judgment, the implication that they had somehow contributed to their own victimization. It was a double burden that many couldn't bear. But I refused to carry that guilt. I knew, with absolute certainty, that I had done nothing to deserve what had happened to me. I had been a victim of a predator, period. There was no provocation, no invitation. Nothing that could justify what Matteo had done to me. This conviction gave me strength to continue, but it did not eliminate the pain. There were moments, especially during the first years after the attack, when I considered moving to another city, starting over where no one knew my story. But Valdepeñas was my home, and I wasn't going to let Matteo take that from me too. Gradually, I began to find ways to heal that didn't depend on the medical or legal system. I started talking to other women in the village who had suffered domestic or sexual violence. I discovered that I wasn't alone, that there was a whole silent network of survivors who supported each other in secret. We formed an informal group that met at the parish on Wednesday nights. We were 5 women of different ages, all marked by male violence in different ways. Laura had been beaten by her husband for 15 years before finding the courage to leave him. Inez had been abused by her uncle during her childhood. Sophia had been attacked by a stranger while returning from work. Marta had been raped by her boss and then fired when she refused to remain silent. These women became my chosen family. Together, we learned that survival was not enough. We had to learn to live again. We had to reclaim our right to happiness, to peace, to love. We gave ourselves permission to be furious, to cry, to be afraid. But we also demanded of ourselves not to get trapped in those emotions. "Pain is inevitable," Marta used to say, who was the oldest in the group and had had more time to process her trauma. "But suffering is optional. We can choose what to do with our pain." Pedro became an extraordinary young man, shaped by growing up with a mother who had survived the unthinkable. He was intelligent, sensitive, protective not only of me, but of all women in his life. He never showed shame for his mother's scars or for the story that had caused them. When he turned 16, Pedro asked me directly about the details of what had happened. Until then, he had known that his mother had been hurt by a bad man, but he didn't know the full story. I felt he had the right to know it, and that he was mature enough to handle it. I told him everything, sparing no details but emphasizing my survival, my strength, my decision to live for him. Pedro cried as he listened, not out of pity for me, but out of something more complex. A mixture of pain for what I had suffered, pride in my strength, and rage at the injustice of it all. "Mommy," he told me when I finished speaking, "now I understand why you're so strong, and I'm honored to be your son. I also understand why Dad left me so easily. Any man who knew your strength and chose to leave is a coward who didn't deserve you." That conversation changed our relationship forever. Pedro stopped seeing me as someone who needed protection and began to see me as the warrior I truly was. He began to understand where my independence came from, why I valued self-determination so much, why I had raised a son to respect women unconditionally. Years later, when Pedro became a lawyer specializing in the defense of victims of gender violence, he asked me to consider speaking publicly about my experience. "Mommy," he told me, "your story could change laws. It could help other women. You have a credibility that comes from having survived and thrived." At first, the idea terrified me. For decades, I had kept my story relatively private, shared only with my inner circle and my support group. But Pedro was right. If my pain could serve a purpose, if my experience could help prevent other women from going through the same thing, then I had a moral obligation to speak. I started giving talks in small groups, in community centers, in high schools. At first, my voice trembled, my hands shook, and I had to pause frequently to control my emotions. But it became easier each time. And every time a young woman approached me after a talk to tell me that my story had helped her, I knew I was doing the right thing. One of those young women was Elena, a 20-year-old girl who had been raped by her boyfriend but hadn't dared to report him for fear of not being believed. After hearing my talk, she found the courage to go to the police. Her case went to trial, and the perpetrator was convicted. "You taught me that we victims don't have to carry the shame," Elena wrote to me in a letter. "The shame belongs to them, not to us. Thank you for teaching me that I can be a survivor instead of a victim." Those letters, those testimonies became my new reason for living. It was no longer just about my personal survival. It was about using my survival to empower other women. It was a way of giving meaning to all the suffering I had endured. In 1993, 18 years after the attack, I received a call that finally closed that chapter of my life once again. Mateo had been arrested again, this time for raping a 19-year-old girl in Toledo. The circumstances were terribly similar. He had offered her a ride, taken her to an isolated place, brutally raped her. But this time, there was a crucial difference. The young woman had died. Mateo had completed what he had attempted to do to me 18 years earlier. The news devastated me, not only for the loss of an innocent life, but for the certainty that if the judicial system had functioned correctly the first time, that young woman would be alive. During the murder trial, I was called to testify about Mateo's pattern of behavior. Seeing that man, now 50 years old, still trying to manipulate the system with his mask of respectability, filled me with a cold rage I hadn't felt since the first days after my attack. This time he was sentenced to life imprisonment without possibility of parole. It was too late for his second victim, but at least there wouldn't be a third. Mateo would die in prison, as he should have the first time. The death of that innocent young woman motivated me to intensify my activism. I began working with women's rights organizations, pushing for legal reforms that would make it harder for rapists to get out of prison early. My story became a symbol of the need to take sexual crimes seriously. Pedro, who by then was an established lawyer, joined my efforts. Together we founded a non-profit organization dedicated to helping survivors of sexual violence and lobbying for legal reforms. We called it Sol de Vida, Son of Life, in honor of both my name and what our mission represented. Through Sol de Vida, we helped hundreds of women navigate the legal system, find psychological support, and rebuild their lives after trauma. Every woman we helped was a victory against the culture that had allowed Mateo to hurt 2 women and kill one. In 2005, 30 years after my attack, I received a call that finally closed that chapter of my life. Mateo had died in prison, apparently of a heart attack. He was 62 years old, having served 12 years of his second sentence. "We thought you'd want to know," the officer who called told me. And he was right. I wanted to know. But what I felt was not relief, as I had expected for so many years. It was a deep sadness for all the lives he had destructively touched, for the human potential he had squandered on evil. The day after receiving that news, I made a decision I had been postponing for decades. I went to visit the place where I had been attacked. Pedro wanted to accompany me, but I told him I needed to do it alone. It was something I had to face by myself without anyone else's support. The place had changed dramatically in 30 years. Where before there were only fields and olive groves, there was now a new housing development with modern houses and manicured gardens. The stream was still there, but smaller and cleaner, channeled for urban development. The trees had grown, and where there was once undergrowth, there was now a small playground. I sat on a bench near where I estimated I had been attacked and cried, as I hadn't cried in years. I cried for the 24-year-old woman who had lost her innocence that day. I cried for all the years of fear, for all the sleepless nights, for all the moments of joy that had been marred by the memory of the trauma, but I also cried with gratitude. Gratitude for having survived, for having managed to build a beautiful and meaningful life despite everything. Gratitude for Pedro, for my grandchildren, for all the women I had helped over the years. Gratitude for having discovered that I was stronger than I had ever imagined. When I returned home that afternoon, I felt different, lighter somehow. It was as if I had left the last vestiges of my pain in that place, as if I had finally been able to completely close that chapter of my life and focus entirely on the present and the future. Pedro married a wonderful woman, Camilla, who knew my story and treated me with the respect and affection any mother-in-law would hope for. Together they gave me 3 beautiful grandchildren, including my first granddaughter, whom they named Sul in my honor. When little Sul was born in 2010, I cried for hours, not from sadness, but from a joy so deep I couldn't contain it. I had survived to see this, to see my legacy continue, to know that my story would not end with violence, but with love and new life. My grandchildren don't know the full details of my story, and perhaps they never will know all of them. To them, I am simply Grandma Sol, who makes the best cookies in the province and always has time for their stories and games. But I hope that by seeing me live my life with purpose and joy, despite my visible scars, they will learn something important about resilience, about the importance of not allowing circumstances to completely define our destiny. My oldest granddaughter, little Sol, who is now 12, once asked me why I have those marks on my neck. I told her they were reminders of a very difficult time in my life, but that they were also symbols of my strength. "Do they hurt, Grandma?" she asked with that genuine concern only children have. "Not anymore, my love," I replied. "They don't hurt at all anymore." And it's completely true. Physically, the scars stopped hurting decades ago. Emotionally, the pain has transformed into something different and much more valuable, into wisdom, into deep compassion, into an iron determination to make my suffering mean something positive for the world. In my later years, I have seen significant changes in how Spanish society treats sexual violence. Laws are stricter. Support for victims is incomparably better. Victim blaming, though it still exists, is less socially accepted. But there is still much work to be done. I continue to receive letters from young women telling me their stories. Some have been attacked by strangers like me. Others have been abused by family members, partners, people in positions of power. All share the same desperate need: to be heard, to be believed, to be supported without judgment. To each of them, I say the same thing I would have liked to hear at 24. It's not your fault. You are not alone. You will survive this, and your life can be beautiful despite what happened. The scar does not define the complete story. It defines only one chapter, and you have the power to write all the chapters that come after. I have also learned to deeply value the small victories in the healing process. The first day I could walk alone down the street without constantly looking over my shoulder. The first night I slept without nightmares. The first day I could talk about what happened without crying. Each of those victories was an act of resistance against trauma, a declaration that life is stronger than death, love more powerful than hate. When I think of that terrible February morning in 1975, I no longer see only horror and trauma. I also see the moment I discovered a strength I didn't know I had. I see the moment I made the most important decision of my life. To live, not just to survive, but to truly live, fully, authentically, without allowing fear to steal another single day from me. That decision has defined every day since then. Every morning I wake up, every smile I share with my grandchildren, every young woman I help find her voice, is an act of defiance against the darkness that once tried to consume me completely. My life has not been perfect, and I don't pretend it has been. I have had moments of deep doubt, of overwhelming despair, of rage that seemed like it would consume me from within. I have made mistakes. I have sometimes been too protective of Pedro, too distrustful of men in general. But I have lived authentically, I have loved deeply, and I have found a noble purpose in my pain. If I could go back in time and change what happened that morning, of course I would do it without a second thought. But I cannot change the past. What I can do, what I have chosen to do every day for the past 47 years, is to ensure that my experience serves as a beacon of hope for other women navigating their own storms. Now, when I look in the mirror, I see a 72-year-old woman whose face tells the complete story of a life lived with purpose. The wrinkles around my eyes speak of decades of genuine smiles, of moments of joy I conquered despite everything. The gray hairs on my head represent wisdom gained through experiences that would have destroyed weaker people. And the scars on my neck, those marks I once thought would define me forever as a victim, are now simply part of the larger, more beautiful story of who I am. They are reminders of my survival, symbols of a strength I didn't even know I possessed. Am Sol. I am a mother, a grandmother, a survivor, an activist, a friend. I am the woman who refused to die in a muddy ravine 47 years ago, who walked 1.5 miles to salvation with wounds that should have killed her, who rebuilt her life from the ashes of the most devastating trauma. I am the woman who chose love over hate, hope over despair, life over death, every day for almost 5 decades. I am the woman who turned her worst nightmare into a source of strength for other women, who transformed her pain into purpose. And if there's one thing I've learned in these 72 years of life, it's that hope is never just for ourselves. Hope is for our children, for the women who will come after us, for the world we want to leave behind when we are no longer here. My deepest hope is that no more women have to go through what I went through. But if they do, I hope they know that they can survive, that they can thrive, that they can find beauty and meaningful purpose on the other side of the most horrible trauma. I hope they know that they are not alone, that there is an invisible sisterhood of survivors who support them, who understand them, who accompany them every step of the way towards healing. That is my complete story. It is not just a story of brutal victimization, but a story of profound transformation. It is not just about what was done to me, but about what I did with what was done to me. It is a story I have carried for 47 years, and which I now place in your hands, hoping that it can light the way for someone else who desperately needs it. Because in the end, all our stories are deeply connected. My survival is their survival. My hope is their hope. My strength can become their strength. And together, one story at a time, we can change the world to be a safer, more just, more compassionate place for all women who will come after us. That is the true victory over the evil that once tried to destroy me. Not just to survive, but to use that survival to create something beautiful, something that makes the world a better place. That is the sweetest revenge against all the Mateos of the world, to live so fully, to love so deeply, and to help so many people that their attempt at destruction becomes a source of creation and hope. And as long as I have breath in my lungs and strength in my heart, I will continue telling this story. I will continue helping other women. I will continue being a voice that shouts in the darkness. You can survive this. Your life can be beautiful. You are not alone.